Hi everybody, this is my first set of notes in third quarter, so I hope you enjoy them. I'm going to try to make them go fast, but I've always said that. And usually they're about a half an hour long, but I'm going to just try to hit some of the main points so you can write down some quality notes. Okay, so this is chapter 34, Franklin D. Roosevelt and the Shadow of War. Span of time we're talking about here is 1933, so at the height of the Great Depression, to 1941, which was the beginning of the war for the United States, at least entrance into the war officially for the United States. I really like the quote in the beginning from the quarantine speech given in 1937. When you quarantine somebody with sickness, you make sure that they stay isolated. So that was the mentality in the beginning of this foreign war. Quarantine speech was given in 1937 in Chicago. The epidemic of world lawlessness is spreading. When an epidemic of physical disease starts to spread, the community approves and joins in a quarantine of the patients in order to protect the health of the community against the spread of the disease. There must be positive endeavors to preserve peace. So that's the mentality in 1937 for many Americans, including the President of the United States. Okay, so the London Conference was a 66-nation conference that was to be held in the summer of 1933. The Americans were invited, and at first, Franklin D. Roosevelt did accept the invitation and was going to send his Secretary of State, Cordell Hull, plus another delegation, or more people in a delegation to go to this conference, but they ended up pulling out at the last second. Americans, really the sentiment, again, in 1933, they only wanted to focus on getting themselves out of the Great Depression. The London Economic Conference was really called in 1933 to stabilize exchange rates and currencies among the industrial nations. But America wanted to focus on its own currency, inflationary policies at home, and therefore withdrew. They felt, and probably, if they would have gone to this conference, they would have been dragged in to more, foreign affairs. But Franklin D. Roosevelt wanted just to make sure that America was back on its feet with its own economy. And as a result, the London Economic Conference collapsed. Now, in hindsight, had the United States gone in and joined this conference, on the flip side, conditions might not have gotten as worse as they did, or as bad as they did, and perhaps war could have been avoided even, starting in as early as 1933. We don't know that for sure. But anyway, just one example here of America's isolationist attitude. Another example where the United States is beginning again to look inward and backward, like I said last week, is freedom from the Filipinos, not for the Filipinos. It's not that the United States had a change of heart, but the United States is looking out for its own interests. And the main motivation during this depressed time economically is to get rid of low-wage Filipino workers and competition in sugar markets. The Tydings-McDuffie Act in 1934 was passed, and this was an act which would eventually give the Filipinos their independence. Basically, a 12-year period was set in which the United States would offer economic and political tutelage. So here, we have that idea of the superiority of Americans. And so by 1946, the Filipinos would have their freedom. However, that would not come to fruition because of the war and because Japan would be taking over the Philippines soon. So if you look at it from the Americans' point of view, it's not that they were giving the Filipinos their freedom, but rather they were trying to free themselves of this Filipino burden. And Japan definitely saw this as an opportunity to jump in, and knowing that the United States was soft on keeping the Philippines in the first place, they saw an opportunity to take over without much of a fight being put up by the Americans. Another interesting move that Roosevelt made in 1933 is that he formally recognized the Soviet Union. So what a change of events from the 1920s. Early on, we had this Red Scare in the country that we had talked about earlier. Now we're changing our tune. Coupled reasons. Roosevelt wanted to establish a diplomatic relationship with the Soviet Union. high hopes for trade. So getting, again, looking at ourselves first, hoping for trade to stimulate the economy, but also Roosevelt, knowing how unstable Europe was at the time and with the rise of Hitler happening, looking toward the future, so developing a friendly relationship with the Soviets will probably be in our best interest down the road. Knowing that Stalin, who's also, don't want to get the wrong idea about Stalin, he's also an awful dictator. But with the rise of Hitler, the mentality was that these two dictators would go at it and slit each other's throats and leave the rest out. So I guess if you had to choose between the lesser of the two evils, we're hoping for a Soviet alliance down the road. Our tune began to change also in Latin America prior to the Great Depression hitting and the economy tanking. We had, as you'd studied, this superiority complex in Latin America, where we felt like we could be, first of all, the policemen of the Western Hemisphere, and then we're investing all kinds of American dollars in Latin America to basically control them. We had troops in Haiti and Venezuela. We had troops pretty much everywhere in Latin America. During the Depression, this was going to change, and it was realized that ruling by the bayonet was not favorable for the United States economically either. Investors backed off in Latin America, began to pull out money out of Latin America, and unlike his cousin, FDR wanted to gain respect in order to help the Western Hemisphere in case of an attack. So he's looking, toward the future, looking at the instability in Europe, and he's seeing this as a chance to really bolster the defense of the Western Hemisphere. In 1934, troops were withdrawn from Haiti. Cuba was released from most of the Platt Amendment, although we would still keep our naval base. And beginning with Cordell Hull early on in the 1930s, the good neighbor policy was in effect and was tested. There was an incident in Mexico where oil fields of Americans were taken over, and instead of sending troops down and defending the oil tycoons, we basically diffused the situation without military intervention. Again, showing good faith on Roosevelt's part. U.S. was beginning to seem more like an eagle than a vulture to many Latin American countries. So this was a good thing in bolstering the defense of the Western Hemisphere. So it was often called the good neighbor policy, something you might want to keep in your back pocket just in case. Cordell Hull, Secretary of State, he thought of what were called the reciprocal trade agreements. This is something that was very good for the United States. So the Reciprocal Trade Agreements Act enacted low tariff policies. It amended the Hawley-Smoot instead of starting from scratch. So it wasn't like a drastic drop, 60% down to 30% boom with one act. It was a gradual decline of the Hawley-Smoot tariff rates. And where does the reciprocity come into play? So if we were willing to drop rates as much as 50%, only if the other country agreed to lower theirs with similar reductions. But this whole act was not approved by the Senate. This was something that was done by the President, by Secretary Hull, without approval of the Senate. So that was, you look at FDR and some of the things that he did during the Great Depression. Sorry there for the little pause. Anyway, by 1939, 21 countries agreed to reduce their tariff rates. And as a result, U.S. foreign trade began to increase. And this led the way for the post-World War II free trade agreements. We had pretty high tariffs since even before the Civil War days. And after World War II, they would gradually come down and free trade agreements would be made down the road. I want to go back to something I said earlier. The Reciprocal Trade Agreements Act was, obviously it's approved by the Senate. It can't be an act or law without approval by the Senate, but the pacts that were made with the United States and countries agreeing to reducing the tariffs did not have to be approved by the Senate. So I just want to make sure that was clear. Okay, so storm cellar isolationism. Um, in the 1930s, in many European nations, uh, like Germany, Italy, the individual is nothing. The state is everything. And you probably remember this from your world history classes. So I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but um, economically, when a country is depressed, um, they tend to grab onto people, demagogues, politicians who promise them um, goods or promise them that they're going to return to their way of life or have these riches, but really have no plan sorted out. Well, some of these dictators, like Hitler, did have their plans in place and perfectly laid out. But in 1936, the USSR led the way with Joseph Stalin, and he began to purge his country of dissidents, and millions died. He led uh, not revolts, but he wanted to disperse the Jews out of the USSR as well. Um, so Joseph Stalin is a pretty ruthless dictator. Millions died under his regime, more than um, who died in World War II. It's pretty horrific. Italy, 1922. Uh, Benito Mussolini was on the rise. He was a fascist, overthrew the king, King Emmanuel of Italy, and he began his dictatorship. Germany, 1933, the rise of Hitler. Um, Liberal use of the big lie. He withdrew Germany from the League in 1933 and began rearming. He put people to work, and then he began to, indoctrinate. He began to brainwash the people of Germany. Um, by using lots of propaganda, he began, his racist spewing, against the Jews. I'm not going to get into a lot of detail with that because of your background in world history. 1936, the Rome-Berlin axis was created between Germany and Italy. Japan, now heading over to the east, 1934, they terminated the Washington Naval Treaty. That was the 553 ratio treaty we had talked about in class. They accelerated the construction of battleships. 1935, they quit the League. And in 1940, they joined Germany and Italy in the Tripartite Pact. And yet, the world stood by and watched this happen, and nothing. The League of Nations could have stopped Japan from doing what they were doing, but they had nothing to back it up with, and they were scared. They didn't want to plunge the world into war like they had seen previously in 1914. Mussolini in 1935 went after the African country of Ethiopia. He had dreams of an African empire. Again, the world stood by, did nothing. So where's the U.S. in all this? Americans still had this belief that the oceans protected them, that they would not be roped in to foreign affairs. They were just going to let the European nations and the Asian nations just duke it out, and we're just going to chill over here and just worry about ourselves. The Johnson Debt Default Act. Here's an example of the storm cellar isolationism. We're locking ourselves in the storm cellar while there's this big tornado outside, and we're not getting out of that cellar. In 1934, debt-dodging nations who were not paying on their debts to the United States could not borrow from the U.S., which is pretty much almost every European nation. So we became a creditor nation after World War I. We had enough money to give away as loans. So any nation that could not pay us back from World War I, they were not allowed to borrow from us. The only country that continued to pay its debts was Finland. So we looked favorably upon Finland when they were in need. Americans were ready to pass an amendment that forbade congressional declaration of war except in case of invasion. That's how isolated we became. And politicians had talked about creating an amendment to take that power away from even Congress. And there's going to be several acts of neutrality that are passed. Blood Business Committee was put together to study why the U.S. went to war in World War I. So prior to World War I, that George Creel and his committee had gotten everybody on board. This is what the United States is fighting for, the spread of democracy. We're making the world safe for democracy. Well, 15 years later, we see a switch in mentality where this was bad that we had gotten involved. How could the United States have sent their sons to war? And there was even a committee to investigate exactly what was the purpose of going to war. They thought, it was Wall Street, it was the business moguls that were sending us to war to make money and profit off the war. Um, but we talked about in class how they were making money even before we had gone into war. So the Neutrality Acts of 35, 36, 37 were passed. And essentially it said when the president proclaimed the existence of a foreign war, would recognize and call it a war, then certain restrictions went into effect. It remained at the mercy of events controlled by the dictators. So if Roosevelt would call a situation a war, we were not allowed to send weapons. We were not allowed to, they forbade Americans from going on certain ships. So that all the things lessons that they had learned from World War I, they were trying to stop, avoid those situations. So really, it's like we're letting the dictators do what they want because we're so afraid of being pulled in to their affairs. A huge example of this in Spain, 1936 to 39. You probably learned about this in world history. The Spanish government was overthrown and the democracy was overthrown, and this was really a dress rehearsal for World War II. These are the big guys all being lined up and see where the chips fell. Dictator Francisco Franco, was assisted by Hitler and Mussolini, and they would send weapons, money, they overthrew the democratic government. Loyalists were supported by Russia. The United States officially stayed out, and Washington continued official relations with the Loyalist government, but Congress, with encouragement of Roosevelt with only one dissenting vote, amended the existing neutrality legislation so as to apply an arms embargo to both the Loyalists and the rebels. So he sat on the sidelines and did nothing. However, 3,000 young men did sign up to go help out the Loyalists. They were known as the Abraham Lincoln Brigade. But an arms embargo went out to both sides in this war. Appeasing Japan and Germany. So 1937, Roosevelt refused to recognize the China incident as war. So the invasion of China by Japan, FDR did not want to call it a war, because if he did, then certain restrictions would go into place. We wouldn't be able to help the Chinese. He did not want to cut off supplying the Chinese. I referenced the quarantine speech in 1937. It called for basically a moral quarantine. Isolationists were not a fan of the quarantine speech. FDR kind of hinted at helping out those who were being attacked, that it was basically our moral obligation to help these nations out. And the example of calling it the China incident and not a war was one example of this. Japan sank the boat Peine in 1937. The Japanese, before World War I, if this would have happened, calls for war probably would have rang out, but we accepted the apology and Americans breathed a sigh of relief. I mean, right there, Americans were killed and we're like, okay, no problem. And then all this time, as you know, meanwhile, Hitler marched upon European countries, began to take them over, and America sat on the sideline while the European countries announced appeasement, the Munich Conference. So this is, world history. Again, I'm not going to get into too much detail, but the British, the French met in Munich with Germany, and Hitler promised, you know what, I'm only going to annex the countries that where Germans are, they speak German, they're nationalists, and I'm calling it good. Well, of course, he's going to break that promise. He marches into the Sudetenland and then later Poland. In August 1939, Hitler and Stalin, this was a shock to everybody, announced the non-aggression pact. Both agreed that once Poland was taken over, that they would split it, and they honored each other, although they really did not trust each other. Many were hoping that Hitler and Stalin, like I said before, would duke it out, but that did not seem possible after the pact between them, because now it looks like they're buddies and they're agreeing not to fight each other. And Hitler now could turn his full attention to Western Europe, as you know. September 1st, 1939. Hitler invades Poland, France, and then England declare war against Hitler. 6 weeks later, the U.S. lifted the embargo laws of the Neutrality Act of 1937. So there's some restrictions that were lifted. Neutrality Act of 1939 was passed after all of this happened. Um, European democracies can buy American war materials, but only on a cash and carry basis. So this was part of the first Neutrality Act of 1939, cash and carry. They have to pay up front with cash, and they have to carry them on their own ships. Again, a lesson learned from World War I. Roosevelt could also proclaim danger zones where merchant ships were not allowed to travel. This definitely hurt China, but favored Western democracies, because obviously China's not going to be able to carry weapons um, on their own boats. I mean, it's very far away, the distance in itself. So um, this hurt China in the long run. All right, so the fall of France. Again, calling upon world history knowledge. Phony war had begun. After September of 1939, the attack on Poland, there was a period where there was nothing. And it was also often referenced as, the phony war. England and France fell silent. Hitler had plans of going after France. So the war, after the 6 months dead period, there was movement again, and it was not good for Western Europe. Also within that time, within that 6 month dead period, the Soviets attacked Finland to secure buffer territory. And the United States, because they were attacked and because Finland had been paying its debt, granted $30 million in non-military supplies to aid the Finns. April of 1940, the Nazi war machine revved up again, marched through Belgium, into France, and by June of 1940, within 6 weeks, France surrendered. This was huge. This was a turning point, because now all that was left was Great Britain. If Great Britain fell, Hitler had control of all of Western Europe, which was a scary prospect. Within a year, Congress appropriated $37 billion to get prepared for war. That was 5 times larger than the New Deal budget. Conscription law was passed on September 6, 1940. This was the first peacetime draft in U.S. history. So Congress, the president, recognized that we can't let Great Britain hang all by themselves, the only democracy left in Western Europe. This was very scary. So they went into action. Okay, bringing aside here with the Holocaust and what was going on in that aspect. So, as you know, throughout Germany and the areas that he had taken over, anti-Semitism was on the rise. The brainwashing had begun several years prior. And on November 9th, 1938, in Germany, this was called Kristallnacht, the Night of Broken Glass. Violence directed by Joseph Goebbels ransacked over 7,000 Jewish shops and almost all synagogues. 91 Jews were killed and 30,000 were sent to concentration camps. So early on in the war, we're going to talk about this with Mr. Brownstein, concentration camps were built all throughout Germany, expanded into Poland. At first, many political prisoners were sent. This was kind of a testing ground. They weren't killing centers yet, but they were work camps. Eventually, by 1938, 1939, things really started to rev up as far as the final solution plans, and that's when they became full-on killing centers. By May 1939, 937 passengers on the St. Louis departed for Havana, Cuba. They had gotten out of Germany, which is a miracle in itself because the borders were tightened. They weren't letting anybody out. But these almost 1,000 passengers had gotten out and had headed for the New World. Can't really call it the New World, but to them probably was the New World. Havana, Cuba. However, most were denied entry. They didn't have the correct Cuban visa to get off the ship. They sailed to the United States, to Miami. The United States would also not let them in. FDR wanted to intervene, but at the last second he did not. He denied them entry. They turned to Canada. Canada denied the almost 1,000 passengers entry. Just horrific. They had to go back. They went back to England, and then many had scattered around Europe, and many would perish thanks to the Holocaust in those countries that had been taken over by Hitler. 1942, the U.S. government starts receiving reports about the genocide that was happening. So as early as 1942, the U.S. government did know what was happening in Germany and throughout Poland and other parts of Europe. And so the War Refugee Board was created. I'm going to have some handouts for you this week to read more about that and the controversy that surrounds FDR and the War Refugee Board. We'll discuss that with Mr. Brownstein. All right. Air attacks against Britain began in August of 1940. This was known as the Battle of Britain, hard fought in the air because England was an island. The only way that Hitler really could attack was through the air, dropping bombs. The Luftwaffe was on full mode attack, and it went on for a month. And there was some technology that the British had developed, like radar, that actually helped them out in this battle. If you ever read about it, pretty interesting. Went on for a full month, and Britain won out. And Winston Churchill had really gained popularity after this battle. Had given many inspirational speeches. Anyway, while that was happening in the United States, the Committee to Defend America, by aiding the Allies, had sprung up. Both isolationists and interventionists could argue both ways to aid the Allies. The interventionists, said that this is our duty, like this is our chance to help Britain in support. Let's see, it says supporters of aid to Britain formed propaganda groups, the most potent of which was the Committee to Defend America. Its argument was double-barreled. To interventionists, it could appeal for direct succor to the British by such slogans as Britain is fighting our fight. To isolationists, it could appeal for assistance to the democracies by all methods short of war, so that the terrible conflict would be kept in faraway Europe. One of the committees to be formed against the war was called the America First Committee. One of the most prominent members was Charles Lindbergh. And the United States eventually, FDR got Congress to approve this. They began to aid Britain by giving leftovers from World War I. And in exchange, Britain handed over defensive base sites along the eastern coast, just in case that we would be attacked. All right, in the middle of all of this, there is an election year, and by one of the names to spring up in this election, Republican Wendell Willkie, and he was a novice in politics, had not been a excuse me, oh, had not been a politician, but was really charismatic and was really a good speech giver, and people were swept up by what he had to say. He was calling Roosevelt, a power-hungry guy, and he was going to get us into war. Democrats responded by nominating Roosevelt. Again, better with a third term than a third-rater. And both promised to stay out of the war. In the end, it was Roosevelt who had gone ahead and won 449 to 82 electoral votes. So this again was in 1940. So really a mandate by the American people that in a time of crisis, they did not care about the two-term tradition. They wanted to stay with somebody who was knowledgeable about the situation. All right. By 1940, Britain was nearing its financial tether. It could no longer pay cash or carry in its own ships because it had gotten so dangerous. So Roosevelt hit scheme of lending or leasing weapons. So when the shooting was over, Roosevelt said the guns and tanks could be returned. But the isolationists were like, why would we want the used stuff back? It doesn't make any sense. But the Lend-Lease Bill, 1776, was signed and approved. Send guns, not sons, was the slogan, and FDR really confirmed by 1940 that we were going to be the arsenal of democracy. So sending these weapons is really like defending our own borders as well. And this was opposed by isolationists and Republicans. They called it the blank check bill. A lot of money being spent, but also a lot of jobs being created. this was really an economic declaration of war, and Hitler recognized this. So Hitler wanted to avoid bringing America in at all costs. He had learned what happened to Germany after America did in World War I, but after this unofficial declaration of war, he ordered the attacking of U.S. ships even outside of war zones. And there was one particular ship that would be destroyed. The Robin War, an unarmed American merchant ship, was destroyed. Okay, so two major events in the war: the fall of France in 1940 and Hitler's invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941. So Hitler did not trust Stalin, decided to go after its oil instead. They needed oil reserves. To everyone's surprise, he did invade in June of 1941, and Roosevelt immediately promised assistance to the Soviets. In August of 1941, the Atlantic Conference was held. So a couple months after the invasion, Churchill met Roosevelt in secret off the coast of Newfoundland, and they created an 8-point Atlantic Charter. A year later, the Soviets would recognize this. This was really an echo of the 14 points by Woodrow Wilson several years earlier. Many opposed imperialistic annexation, self-determination, and a permanent system of general security. A new League of Nations would be formed. So it is really echoing what Woodrow Wilson had stated several years earlier. Okay, the problem with the Lend-Lease program, it could, and FDR did approve of this, involve convoys, so the use of American ships to protect the main cargo, and they would be shot at. And in July, and they were, in July of 1941, Roosevelt did make the decision to the convoy system all the way up to Iceland, and then Britain's ships would take over. Hitler did give orders to shoot, only in self-defense in this region, but Roosevelt gave a shoot on sight order. So we did have some servicemen that were killed and merchant marine men that were killed. And in November 1941, the teeth of the Neutrality Act of 1939 was pulled. Merchant ships could legally be armed. So step by step, we're getting closer in this unofficial war to declaring it official war. So surprisingly, we didn't get pulled into war, at least by declaration, with Europe, or attacked by them, but instead we were attacked in Hawaii at Pearl Harbor. Okay, so backing up, what was Japan up to in the 1930s? Up to no good in China, but the U.S. held off on an embargo because of fears of attacks in the Dutch East Indies. We were afraid that they would retaliate. By 1940-1941, when the world was incredibly unstable, we cut off Japan, bound supplies, and was followed by a freeze in all assets in the U.S. and a cessation of all shipments of gasoline, which was the kicker. They did send negotiators into Washington, D.C. in November or December 1941. Here's the deal. They could pull out of China and resume U.S. trade, or else there was no other option. For Japan, this was not reasonable, and the only option for them left open was an attack. Officials knew Japan was going to choose war. The U.S. government did know that. They thought the attack was going to happen, though, in the Far East. They did not think Japan was capable of making it to Hawaii. But on December 7th, 1941, known as Black Sunday, they did take us by surprise at Pearl Harbor. 3,000 casualties. Battleship fleet was mostly wiped out. We had 8 battleships destroyed or severely damaged. Numerous small vessels destroyed. 3 aircraft carriers were out. Thank goodness were out to sea that were not damaged. That could have been terrible. We had several planes that were damaged. It was a horrific scene. December 11th, 1941, Germany and Italy would declare war against the U.S. As we declared war several days earlier, December 8th, on Japan. America's transformation from bystander to belligerent. So belligerent means to attack. Before Pearl Harbor, Americans still wanted to stay out of war. After the attack, isolationists were blasted into silence. There was only one dissenting vote in the Senate. And however, this attack was long in the making. Like I just said, it started with the fall of France. Really was the turning point. We didn't want to see Britain fall to Germany, so we sent unneutral aid, inviting sub-attacks. We also sent Soviet supplies, after they were invaded. U.S. cut off vital supplies to Japan to halt their march in the east, which also hurt American trade. So this was not something that just popped up several years